China, the Middle Kingdom, is a civilization which stretches back for more than 3,500 years.
Everybody was kung fu fighting. Those kids were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening. But they fought with smart timing. There were funky Chinamen from funky Chinatown. They were chopping them up. They were chopping them down. It's an ancient Chinese art, and everybody knew their part.
This one has been reading a lot of cultivation fantasy books, and so I have tried out different cultivation games, but I quickly realized that if you want a proper cultivation game, you have to go to Canada, and so I replayed Jade Empire.
As I mentioned, I am but a simple bun-master, with a dear wife who has turned my life into a miserable cesspool devoid of humor and excitement. Bless her soul.
Like all good stories, it references Wheel of Time, and you start in a small town of 2 rivers where you are the star pupil of a small martial arts school. As expected, the town is attacked, your master gets kidnapped, and you get pulled into a vast conspiracy involving the very future of the Empire. Like many Bioware games, you get to make story choices which affect your rank on a binary totally not good and evil scale. Inspired by Reverend Insanity, I intended to make an evil character, but I found some of the evil options to be outright silly, and since this game does the same shit as Mass Effect, where you are punished if you don't commit to a playstyle, I ended up playing as a goody two-shoes character. As usual, you get a handful of companions. Overall, I like them, and there are some fun ones.
Well, I suppose that's it. I'm gonna miss those little bastards. They tried so hard, they just kept coming, one after another, practically throwing themselves on my axes. You have to respect that kind of mindless dedication. Ah well, let's go find something else to cleave.
There is also romance.
Many months later.
However, I found it to be a bit sudden and silly.
But I want you to know something. I care for you, and I want to explore what we mean to each other in more intimate surroundings.
But whatever floats your boat. The big drawback in terms of the companions is that you only get to take one with you when you are out exploring. So companion banter and input is limited to the camp, which is a big letdown. Thankfully, many of the side quests delivers, and there are plenty of fun and memorable encounters.
I am afraid I cannot do that. That would be trade, and I simply will not sully my beautifully soft hands with such. I will tell you for free, however.
In terms of the main story, I think it is competent. It is not the most complex story, but the setting is cool and there are enough twists and turns to keep it engaging. It did run out of steam towards the end, especially so since it starts to get more focused on the combat, which is not very good. But before I shit on the combat, you might ask, dumlepumle, how is the story compared to the cultivation books? What a silly question to ask. Cradle is no Wheel of Time, but it is not even a fair fight if you compare it to Jade Empire. The writing in most books kick the shit out of the writing in most games. While old school Bioware were miles above the usual video game writing slop, it is still nowhere near book level. Beware of Chicken, a yoke book about chicken martial artists, still kicks the shit out of Jade Empire in terms of writing. It is not even close. I pity the fools who don't read. The story of Bioware games and other of its kind will also always be held back due to the empty and soulless main character. But whatever, I was shitting on the combat.
Legendary strike, longsword. This is legendary strike.
It is not very good, it's simplistic, janky and unbalanced. Important fights are made trivial. And random fights will have weird difficulty spikes. Ghost fights in particular can be a pain as they are immune to your most effective attacks. It's the type of combat that works in the early game where it is fresh, done in small doses and mixed in with exploration and story. But later in the game it gets more combat heavy and it's just not very good. What makes it more frustrating is that there are actually a fair amount of different combat stances, which could have added some much needed variety. But the RPG system forces you to lock into a small amount of stances, which restricts experimentation with new ones. It is just a very odd choice. Another odd choice is that they hide away the stats of the combat styles. Apparently they were so proud of this choice that they brought it back to Mass Effect 2. I mean, I am completely fine with them abstracting away the background math, but at the very least tell me the stats of the style I'm using. But the RPG mechanics are in general super light. You have 3 attributes which affect both combat and social skills. All 3 are kind of needed, so it's just a matter of which one of these you want to excel at. There are no armors or clothes, but you have some gem slots, which impacts the before mentioned attributes. It's fine, but it's bare bones and not really worth talking about. Now, it might sound like I am not a big fan of Jade Empire, but that is not correct. To make you understand what I like about Jade Empire, we need to take a bit of a side tour and shit on Baldurs Gate 3.
Oh god, here it comes! Oh, hot, 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 hot! Hot, 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 hot!
I read all the greatest philosophers and consulted with wise men before reaching this decision. I assure you the philosophical underpinnings are quite sound.
So when I was young, I was a big fan of role-playing games. Mostly games from Bioware and Obsidian, but also games like The Witcher, Vampire, Fable and so on. So you would expect me to love Baldurs Gate 3, Dragon Age Inquisition and Pathfinders, but I don't. That doesn't mean that they are bad games, but just as when I play Wreckfest and realize that this is nothing like Flatout. I play Baldurs Gate 3 and realize that this is nothing like Dragon Age Origins or Knights of the Old Republic. Some of you might say, no shit Sherlock, one is real time with pause and the other is turn-based. This is of course true, but the RPGs I loved when I was growing up had vastly different combat systems. Some were real-time with pause, others were shooters and others were third-person action games. But they had something in common, and that is a good balance between story, exploration and combat. During this summer I replayed Mass Effect 1, and then Mass Effect 2 and finally Jade Empire. These games have their own individual strengths and weaknesses, but they share a structure in the sense that they are made up by smaller levels that you explore with some combat encounters and story interaction. The pacing is reasonably high, and if I sit down to play these games for an hour, then I can reasonably expect to get some exploration, some combat and some story progression. Now the phony intellectuals among you might say that this is just another case of an old man romanticizing the games he played when he was young. And yes, there might be some truth to that, but I also think there is something concrete here. So if we start with the most recent RPG darling, Baldurs Gate 3, then a fun fact is that no one I know in real life have actually beaten it, myself included.
Really makes you think.
Almost all of the playtime in that game is spent exploring and fighting. The combat is extremely slow, and so the pacing of the game and its story crawls to a halt. Divinity 1 and Divinity 2 had the exact same problem. Sure, Baldur's Gate's story might be a step up, but the narrative quickly takes a backseat to endless exploration and combat. If you love the combat, then good for you, but I found it quickly becoming stale and boring. Then there is a new Dragon Age coming up. I am hoping that it will be good, of course, but I am worried that it will fall into the same trap as Inquisition. The story of Inquisition wasn't that great, but the real letdown of that game is the focus on big grindy open world nonsense that drags out the game with endless filler. Sometimes I consider replaying that game, but then I look at the playtime of my first playthrough. Hell no. Point is that while very different games, both Inquisition and Baldur's Gate 3 ends up focusing on exploration and combat to the degree that the story, pacing and the replayability suffers. Pathfinders have the same problem, and I would say the same for Pillars, Underrail and many others. I realize that I am painting with a wide brush here, and above games have their own pros and cons, of course. Some I enjoyed, while others I didn't, but the point is that if I sit down and play these games for an hour, then I am very likely to only get combat and exploration and little to no story progression. You can compare that to the recent Shadowrun games that have a structure that I found to be much more similar to the games that I played when I grew up. Those games are made up by shorter and varied missions, and if I play those games for an hour, then I can reasonably expect to get some story progression, some combat and some exploration. And guess what? I have good memories of those games. However, this is not just the case of newer games missing the mark. I would argue that even a lot of older games have the exact same issue. If you look at older Baldurs Gate, Fallout, Neverwinter Nights, Arcanium and so on, they have the exact same issue. If I play Baldur's Gate for an hour, then it's likely that I will spend the entire time in some enormous map fighting 10,000 gnolls or something. But why is this important? Well, I for one see an inherent value in the story progressing with a reasonable pace, and the gameplay being varied. The combat in Alpha Protocol might not be perfect, mildly speaking. But as it occurs in small doses and is constantly mixed with stealth, exploration and story, the experience still becomes enjoyable.
So, my friend, what do you need?
You can shut up and let me work.
The combat in Baldurs Gate 3 and in Pathfinder might be more competent than Alpha Protocol, but as you are doing it hour after hour, it needs to stand on its own legs. And for me it just doesn't, and I end up falling into the trap of listening to podcasts or YouTube videos in the background, which is a clear sign that my mind is elsewhere. Now I am not saying that all of my childhood games have the perfect holy trinity of story, exploration and combat. Neverwinter Nights 2 had some long-ass dungeons, if I remember correctly, but they are far superior to a lot of other modern RPGs. It might also be that this mix was an accidental side effect caused by small levels due to technical limitations, but antibiotics was also found by an accident, and this holy trinity just works. For me at least. And for me, a lot of newer RPGs have lost their way in creating an experience that captures and holds my attention. Instead, a lot of newer RPGs are games that I like the idea of enjoying, but when I'm actually playing them, I find myself growing bored and realizing that I'm not getting that much out of them. Kind of the same like most grand strategy games.
Oh, snap!
I have been reading a lot during this summer, and if I go out and sit on my balcony to read a book for a couple of hours while drinking spritz, then I will get something out of that. I want to be able to expect the same when I play role-playing games, and if the games are not able to deliver that, then that is not something I want in my daily life. There is also something very sad, in that a lot of time seems to be spent creating these enormous open areas that in my mind just screws up the pacing and gameplay mix of these games. Some of you might say, that's a cool opinion bro, but Baldurs Gate 3 sold great, so apparently people don't agree with you. Yes, maybe, but sheeple gonna sheeple, and trend chasers will chase trends. Let us give it a couple of years and see if they can replicate the success of Baldurs Gate 3. Also, you can show some generic harem anime to some uncorrupted guy, and he will think it's some kind of avant-garde shit. That doesn't mean that this anime is the second coming of Christ that will impress harem connoisseurs like me. I asked a friend why he liked Dragon Age Origins and not Divinity 2, and he said that Divinity was just så jävla träligt. Träl is the old Viking word for slave, and as an adjective it is to describe that it feels like you slave away at something. And I feel that describes a lot of bloated RPGs with terrible pacing. If I wanted to play games that feel like a second job, I would just play MMOs or farming sims. Very long story short, Jade Empire has for the majority of the game a good balance between exploration, combat and story. This makes up for a lot of its many shortcomings. Combine that with a reasonable game length, and it is just an enjoyable role-playing game if you want to go on a grand adventure in China for 20-ish hours. I would certainly recommend it.
More days are sleeping.